Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Well, tonight we're going to take up what some people call the Olivet Discourse, which is a teaching of Yeshua to his disciples that took place on the Mount of Olives as they were all sitting and overlooking the temple as they were moving out one evening and just looked back and began this. We're going to have a total of 7 studies. There'll be 6 more after this one. Will be the last teachings of our foundation building series prior to the study of the book of Revelation itself. So this is kind of a thing that puts it all together. The Olivet Discourse is found in 3 books: Matthew 24, the entire chapter; Mark 13, the entire chapter; and Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 38. And we'll need to put a marker, those of you that are listening to this either online or CD, we'll need to put a marker in each of these as we will move back and forth through all 3 books, and you won't be able to see them as they're projected here this evening. We are going to cover the parallel material that's presented in each one of the Gospels that it's presented in. And in other words, what we will read in Matthew, we'll read in Mark, and we'll also read in Luke, because each writer covers this from a little different perspective. And quite frankly, those of you that are familiar with these passages probably view them from a little bit of a different perspective. But now that we have a thorough study of the book of Zechariah under our belts, particularly those last studies of Zechariah chapters 12 and 14, we're probably going to come up with even a little bit more differences in perhaps the way that we view these. That information that we took out of Zechariah chapters 12 through 14 is going to give us a lot of insight. It's a good foundation for what's going on in the Olivet Discourse. Our goal this evening, we're going to take this very slowly, but our goal this evening is to get through Matthew chapter 24 up to verse 6. The year is 30 of the Common Era. We can say that with some confidence because the full moon of the first month of Aviv, now called Nisan in some forms, the month of the Passover, if you will, occurred that year. That first day of that month occurred that year on Wednesday night into Thursday. That happened because the full moon, that would be the middle of the month, of that month, that first month, occurred on a Wednesday evening into Thursday, which correctly fits the sequence of the events that are laid out in the Gospels for this to happen. There's no other Gospel anywhere even close that begins to fit this parameter. In order for him to be out of the tomb at sundown on Saturday evening so that they can find an empty tomb on Sunday, he has to go into the tomb before sundown on a Wednesday. 3 complete days and 3 complete nights in the tomb. Now, this available information about this Wednesday evening of this year 30 is based on information published by the United States Naval Observatory. It's there for the reading. This dissertation is really in a very short time before Yeshua goes to the execution stake. He's really holding this conversation with his disciples just days before he goes on the execution stake and becomes a sin sacrifice for all of the world. In order to better understand this, though, we're going to actually start this in Matthew chapter 23. This Olivet Discourse actually follows a really solemn, angry, if you will, denunciation of the Judean leadership that takes place at the end of Matthew chapter 23. And he's on them particularly for their lack of sincerity, their lack of sympathy, their lack of humility. And for all these sins, judgment is pronounced upon them. Now, I want us to notice the harsh language that Yeshua uses in referring to these leaders as we read through this. So give me Matthew 23, verses 33 through 36, please. Notice how it starts. No anger involved here. You snakes, sons of snakes, how can you escape being condemned to hell? Gehenna being hell. Therefore I am sending you prophets, sages, and Torah teachers. Some of them you will kill. Indeed, you will have them executed on stakes as criminals. Some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. Next. And so on you will fall the guilt for all the innocent blood that has ever been shed on the earth. Now, think about that condemnation. Those people that get involved with those that Yeshua sends to give them the truth, that end up doing them in and doing them away with them, are going to be charged with all of the innocent blood that's ever been shed on the earth, from the blood of the innocent Havel, that's Eve, to the blood of Zechariah ben Bechariah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Yes, I tell you that all this will fall on this generation. Now, he's saying this just before he gets into chapter 24, what we call chapter 24, and that's pretty rough language. The meaning of the allusion to snakes and son of snakes can only be taken to being, speaking to them being little Satans, and to Satan himself, the ancient serpent, if you will, of Eden. In speaking of the adversaries to the will of God, he's condemning them to that format, if you will. The condemnation is judgment, is harsh, and again Yeshua gives us a peek in doing this at his role when he returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, because he's going to be sorting out everything, and those that aren't good are going to be condemned, be gone into Gehenna. Then immediately following this, still in Matthew 23, there is a moving lament and a really terrible prophecy of the judgment against Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem. Matthew 23, verses 37 through 39, please. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets. You stone those who are sent to you. How often I wanted to gather your children just as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but you refused. Look, God is abandoning your house to you, leaving it desolate. Keep that verse 38 in mind. We're going to come back and look at that in some thoroughness. Verse 39, for I tell you from now on, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The Hebrew in that is Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Until Jerusalem and Israel call out for his return, he ain't coming back. That's what he's telling them. You're not going to see me again until you utter these specific words. Now, following all this statement that he's making, and he's done this in the temple grounds, the area around the temple, Yeshua and his Talmudim are leaving the temple. It's assumed to be towards evening. They're headed back towards Bethany, Betania, where they're staying. And they would have been headed east, away from the temple, crossed over the Kidron Valley, been heading towards the top of the Mount of Olives. And at some point before they reached the summit of the Mount of Olives, all of the Temple Mount, the top of the Temple Mount, and the temple itself would come into full view. Remember that the Mount of Olives is higher than the Temple Mount until the return of Yeshua. About 200 feet higher until he sets his foot down on it, and it splits into this huge valley. So as they near the top of the Mount of Olives, they have a full view of the Temple Mount and of the temple. Figure it's still daylight, the sun's reflecting off the stones that the temple is constructed of, and it's frankly a magnificent sight. And you just imagine that you could be standing up there and you could see the temple on the Temple Mount with the evening sun and its warmth and its glow and everything just falling on that just kind of gives me the oohs and ahs. Now, the ancient historian Josephus, to kind of give us a little different angle on this, was born about 37 to 38 Common Era. Not long after this, he would have been in his 30s when the temple was destroyed in about 70 of the Common Era. Josephus is an important source for us of historical facts of this that go along with what the Bible is telling us. He stated this about the magnificence of the temple. The temple was built of hard, white, ornate stones, each of which was about 25 cubits long. That's 37 feet long. You got any idea how long 37 feet is? It's like from here to the back of the room. Okay? If you continue with that measurement, the stones were 8 cubits high. That's about 12 feet. Now, if you figure that I'm about 6 feet, from here to the top of that screen's 12 feet. That's how high those stones was. So figure they're this long, they're that high, but it also gives us a width. They're 12 cubits wide. That's 18 feet. 18 feet, not 18 inches, 18 feet, like from that post there to the wall over here. Them's little bitty stones. Them's big rocks. Anyhow, that's the kind of stones the temple was made up of. Even the religious leaders that hated Herod the Great stated in their writings, quote, "He that never saw Herod's edifice has never in his life seen a beautiful building," end quote. This said because of the temple's massive size and grandeur. And at that time, the temple complex took up about 1/6 of the city area of the old city of David. That's just a hair under 20% of the space, around 16% of the space of all of David's old city that was created by David to become Jerusalem the capital. Now, because of the temple's massive size, it's regarded as one of the wonders of the world at that time. Now, I want to take us back to Matthew 23:28, which is still up there, which says, "Look, God is abandoning your house to you, leaving it desolate." Now, everybody immediately thinks he's abandoning the temple, leaving it desolate. But we have to understand that the temple almost immediately, within in just a couple of decades, 3 decades, 4 decades, is destroyed. So what is this talking about as it says, abandoning your house to you, leaving it desolate? Well, David Stern makes a commentary on this, and I want us to look at this because this whole business of abandoning your house and leaving it desolate requires some thinking beyond the actual temple. David Stern, in his commentary, brings up Jeremiah 22, verse 5, which he believes Yeshua is referring to here as he is speaking of the house being abandoned and being left desolate. Therefore, that, speaking of the house being abandoned, and Therefore, he takes a position that Yeshua is not, Stern takes a position that Yeshua is not referring to the physical temple here, which was destroyed by Rome, as I mentioned, 40 years after this dissertation. He's talking about what's being made desolate here, not the temple, but the future house of Israel, future generations of Israel, that being the house that's being made desolate. They will be desolate of salvation because they will have rejected Yeshua. They will be desolate of salvation as they seek salvation by their own actions. They're not ever going to get any. It won't be there unless they turn ultimately to Yeshua. And that is God abandoning your house, Israel, to you, leaving it desolate. This is caused by their not welcoming their Messiah. It's not difficult to see how both physical and spiritual meaning are possible in this statement, particularly as we look back through history at both the spiritual and physical events surrounding Israel and Jerusalem. Now, Stern also does a second thing here. I'm using him as an example this evening pretty broadly. David Stern also points out something that's interesting about Matthew 24 in its entirety. And he says, quote, "It's interesting to compare this chapter 24 of Matthew with a Talmud passage that predicts events prior to Messiah's coming." Is everybody familiar with what the Talmud is? The Talmud's Jewish writings that were laid out, a lot of them well before Yeshua came the first time, that talk about things that are going to happen over the future time based on their understanding of Scriptures speaking towards the coming Messiah. So it's interesting to compare this chapter 24 with a Talmud passage that predicts events prior to Messiah's coming. I'm going to read this to you. Rabbi Yitzhak said that Rabbi Yochanan said, "In the generation that the son of David is to come," that would be the Messiah, "scholars will be few in number. As for others, their eyes will fail for sorrow and grief. There will be much trouble, and evil decrees will be renewed, with each evil coming quickly, even before the other is ended. Our rabbis taught that the following would happen during the 7 years, at the end of which the son of David is to come." Now, to fully understand this, we have to understand that they're talking about the final 7 years that we also talk about. Those final 7 years before Messiah comes back to take over and rule the world. Now, in the first year, I will cause it to rain on one city and not to rain on another. In the second, the arrows of hunger will be sent forth. That would be talking about food shortages, with no one being satisfied. In the third year, there will be great famine, in which men, women, children, pious men, and saints will die. And hunger will cause the Torah to be forgotten by its Talmudim, by its disciples. In the fourth, there will be surpluses of some things, but shortages of others. In the fifth, there will be a great plenty. People will eat and drink and rejoice, and the Torah will return, that is, become focused again by its Talmudim. In the sixth year, there will be sounds or heavenly voices or shofar blasts announcing the Messiah is coming. And in the seventh year, there will be wars, and at the end of the 7 years, the Son of David will come. Now, all this is written out, really probably before the first coming of Messiah. This is all from Talmud, from the chapter Sanhedrin 97a. Those of you who want to go online and open it up and read it for yourselves. It's interesting that Talmud has this concept of the events preceding the coming of Messiah, that the Orthodox particularly would really look at these. And if we're familiar with these, when we want to take somebody in the Jewish community that's searching, if we're familiar with this, we can take them to that and show them the comparison to what our beliefs actually are. This is a great witnessing tool. Now, with all this in mind that we've just looked at, let's go to Matthew 24:1, also Mark 13:1, and Luke 21:5. Put them all three up on the screen so we can read them together. It says, as Yeshua left the temple and was going away, his Talmudim came and called his attention to its buildings. That's Matthew 24:1. Mark 13:1, as Yeshua came out of the temple, one of the Talmudim said to him, look, Rabbi, what huge stones, what magnificent buildings. Luke 21:5, as some people were remarking about the temple, how beautiful its stonework and memorial decorations were, he said, and we're going to follow that in just a minute. Notice the similarity in what's being said here. All three of these renditions of the Olivet Discourse are essentially saying the same thing, and there's a note in this where it says, Yeshua left the temple, Yeshua came out of the temple. Yeshua didn't leave the temple, he didn't come out of the temple. He came away from the Temple Mount because he did not, on his first coming, come anywhere close to going into the physical temple itself. They wouldn't have let him because he was from the tribe of Judah, not a Levite. Secondarily, it was not his job to go in to the temple. He will do that on his return when he goes in as King of Kings and Lord of Lords and sets up his kingdom ruling from there, but he was not there to rule that first time. So keep that in mind. The disciples, the Talmudim, are making comment here in all three of these to Yeshua on how the temple is adorned with such massive and beautiful stones, the magnificence of the buildings. And the Talmudim are showing how impressed they were with the temple, its grandeur, its apparent strength. And what a contrast was this view that met their eyes with the statements that Yeshua just made a short time ago in Matthew 23. You know, they're saying this temple is here and how wonderful it is and everything. And Yeshua, in the end of Matthew 23, before this, had just blown stuff away that was going on in the temple. It wasn't such a great place, but largely because of the leadership that was in place in the temple. Now, I'm sure the Talmudim, the disciples, recognized that there was a certain element of fraud that was in the temple, that over the centuries had crept into what we could call the temple religion, for lack of a better term. Some fraud had slipped in. Sometimes, though, it would be ultimately dominating the temple. I'm going to give you a quick example of something that could be dominating there. Let's go back to Matthew 21:12, please. Yeshua entered the temple grounds and drove out those that were doing business there, both the merchants and their customers. He upset the desks of the money changers and knocked over the benches of those who were selling pigeons. He went in and cleaned house. Now, there was this problem in the temple with what took place. It was corrupted to some time. Actually, this was the first day that Yeshua went up on that last trip to Jerusalem and cleaned house. The temple, though, even though we had this corruption going on, people of true piety and faith would come there consistently to worship the Lord there. As an example, at the time Yeshua was born, after 8 days had elapsed, Miriam and Joseph took Yeshua to the temple to be dedicated. Another example is Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was a priest in the temple who was called a godly man. There were many men who would be called godly men, but the people that controlled the system had corrupted themselves. At the time of Yeshua, though, as a baby was in the temple, for instance, there was Shimon, the elderly man, that the Holy Spirit had told him that he would not die before he saw the glory of Israel. Well, Yeshua is being defined here as the glory of Israel. And Hannah, The widow who lived in the temple area and served God for many years came and prophesied over the infant Yeshua, and she could have done that only basically if that she was someone that was considered to be holy. There were many godly people. We should never get the impression that the people of Israel in and of themselves were ungodly people, but there was certain pollutions had been introduced into the temple system by its leaders, such as all of the coin changers and everybody that Yeshua had to kick out as he went up to the temple. What the disciples of Yeshua didn't understand was that because of these leaders, those particularly that opposed Yeshua and his teachings and wanted to do away with him, who had rejected him in spite of what he showed them, these corrupt leaders who were determined to reject Yeshua were taking with them in their direction the vast majority of the people who blindly followed their leadership. See, people do that, sometimes to degrees that amaze us. Anybody remember a cult leader named Jim Jones, Jonestown in Guyana, years ago, and all of his people killed themselves when he told them to? Blindly following the leader. There was David Koresh of the Branch Davidians, if you remember him. The Koreshans, different group, down the road here in Estero that came in and set that up in the 1920s were told not to reproduce themselves because the Lord was coming back and you don't want to have any children in place when he comes back. Blindly following their leaders. Back to Israel that we're pointing to and talking to at the moment, the people would blindly follow their leadership. Their leadership had decided we got to get rid of this Yeshua because he's taken the people away from us, so they began setting this up. And the people would blindly follow their leadership and reject Yeshua as Messiah. And by doing this, they would seal their own fate, and they would seal the fate of the city and of the temple. See, it's for this reason that the temple would be destroyed as a judgment. Their spiritual blindness would cause the temple to be destroyed as a judgment. Let me give us some food for thought here. There are teachings in some areas of the body of Messiah that the destruction of the temple, Second Temple, is a great example that the old theological dispensation ended right then at that moment because they didn't need the temple anymore. Now let me explain dispensation just so everybody understands it the same as I'm thinking it. It's a system of principles and rules for a period of time only. That dispensation, that period of time when that system of principles and rules are in effect. It's a system of principles and rules for a period of time only. And some places in the body of Messiah it's taught that with the destruction of the temple, the old dispensation, the old system of principles and rules for the temple period ceased to exist completely. They have vanished, they've been done away with in order to make room for the new dispensation that was setting in following Messiah having made his first trip here. But understand, if it's been gone away with, if it's no longer in effect, how come we're going to have a temple back here with him in it and things going on again? In pure dispensationalism, it's impossible for things of the new dispensation and the old dispensation to exist at the same time. And if you've had the last few studies on Zechariah that we went through, you realize that there's a problem with that, frankly, a considerable problem with that. And the fact is that there is another explanation. When Solomon's temple was destroyed back in 586 BCE, it was for a particular reason. The people had gone after other gods in that temple itself. They were holding services for false gods. They had set up idols in rooms and were worshiping them there to the point that the God that the temple was dedicated to, our God, was no longer the central focus of the people there. They had ceased also to keep Adonai's Shabbat because they were following all of these other false gods. And it's interesting what Scripture says about that, not keeping Adonai's Shabbats. I want to look at two verses quickly. First is Jeremiah 17, please, 27. If you will not obey me and make Shabbat a holy day, and on that day is implied here, and not carry loads through the gates of Jerusalem on Shabbat, then I'll set his gates on fire. I will burn the palaces of Jerusalem and not be quenched. Okay. Then there's 2 Chronicles 36:21. This is talking, that first one was talking about the day of Shabbat, the Saturday. 2 Chronicles 36:21. Thus was fulfilled the word of Adonai spoken by Jeremiah, until the land has paid for her Shabbats. For as long as it lay desolate, it kept Shabbat until 70 years has passed. The land has paid for its Shabbats. It's going to have to do this by lying desolate for 70 years until all of those unpaid Shabbats have passed. This is not talking about your weekly Shabbat. This is talking about the sabbatical year. On God's calendar, the 7th year of every 7-year cycle is a sabbatical year. And you do this 7 times, and then the 50th year is a really special day. No crops were planted on the sabbatical year. Vines were not pruned or tended on the sabbatical year. All slaves were to be set free. All debts were to be forgiven. Israel had failed to keep these sabbatical years, these 7th years, for 490 years. Almost since Solomon's time. And God says, you owe me. Since you've done this, rejected my sabbatical years, Jerusalem will lay fallow for 70 years. And he emptied Jerusalem with the Babylonian exile, and they didn't come back for 70 years. 1 year for each sabbatical period of 7 years not kept. So if we take that destruction of the temple and Jerusalem then, 583 BC, tied to the violation of the sabbatical year, let's pose an interesting thesis here by adding something else. Turn to Matthew 12, 5 through 8, please. Or if you haven't read in the Torah that on Shabbat the Kohanim profane the Sabbath, yet are blameless, because the Kohanim, the priests, work on the Sabbath. They do the sacrifices, they do all that, yet they're blameless. Verse 6, I tell you, there is in this place something greater than the temple. Aha! We're moving beyond the temple being blasphemed. If you knew what, quote, I want compassion rather than animal sacrifice meant, you would not condemn the innocent. And then verse 8 is the focus. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Wow. Our focus here is on that last verse. Yeshua defines himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. And now at his first coming, they've rejected the Son of Man, the Lord of the Sabbath, and they're actually going to put him to death. They actually did put him to death. So do we see a tie in here between the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 583 BCE because they rejected God's sabbatical years, and here where they reject the Lord of the Sabbath? And the temple is again destroyed. Interesting tie-in and concept to think about. That the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era had a deeper significance than just because of the sins of the people. Matthew 24:2, please. Matthew 24:2, but he answered them, you see all these? Yes, I tell you, they will be totally destroyed. He's talking about that temple they've just said was so great. Not a single stone will be left standing. Mark 13:2. Yeshua is answering again. You see all these great buildings? Yeshua said to him, they will be totally destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing. And Luke 21:6 says, the time is coming when what you see here will be totally destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing. Remember, they were on the Mount of Olives looking down at the temple, and not a single stone will be left standing. Etch that into your minds. Not a single stone will be left standing. And remember, we described the immensity of these stones. that are going to be torn down. That was no small project. That took a whole bunch of guys determined to pry them all loose and everything. Now, the statement here indicates total destruction. With this, every outward religious foundation would be taken away from the Jewish people. With that temple gone, they have no basis for anything that's religious within Judaism at the time. And we also need to note, we'll get to that in a minute, that very soon Messianic Judaism would be expelled also from the rest of Judaism. One of the dangers was when this all happened with the temple being destroyed, that infant Messianic congregations would waver and abandon their faith and go back to things. But we want to look at an overall picture in this. So Yeshua is going to tell them about what's going to happen. That's going to be his answer as he continues from what we looked at here. You see all these things, I tell you, they will be totally destroyed. This temple, not a single stone will be left standing. He's going to tell them everything that's going to happen to them that's coming as this temple is destroyed and beyond that, so that people would maintain their faith in the teeth of what's going to be happening. They would have no surprises. People that were believers and following him would have no surprises. The prophecies in verse 2 were literally fulfilled. In 70 of the common era, the temple was totally destroyed. Totally destroyed. I want to take us to Josephus again, because he was living at that time, saw the temple with his own eyes, and he was an accurate historian of the time of the destruction of the temple. Give us some just brief excerpts, a little of the flavor, if you will, of the literal fulfilling of Yeshua's words. Quoting from Josephus, "The building, however, God long ago had sentenced to flame." In other words, the fact that the temple was destroyed shouldn't be anything new to you. God had already given us a picture of this a long time ago. Now, in the revolution, the turning of the time periods, we're talking about the revolution, not a people rebelling, but the revolution, the turning of time, the advancing of years, the spinning of the globe. Now, in the revolution of time periods, the fateful day had arrived that the temple would be destroyed, that was spoken of. The 10th of the month of Av, the very day on which it had been previously burned by the king of Babylon, one of the soldiers, be a Roman soldier, neither awaiting orders, and I'm going to pause in here and interject something for you. It was very clear that Rome had given instructions not to destroy the temple as Jerusalem was being taken over. Vespasian was the emperor, and those were his instructions. Okay, taking this back to Josephus again. One of the soldiers, neither awaiting orders nor filled with horror at so dread an undertaking, but moved by some supernatural impulse, snatched up a firebrand from the blazing timber, that's Jerusalem on fire outside the temple, and hoisted up by one of his fellow soldiers, flung the fiery missile through the golden window of the temple. When the flame arose, a scream, listen to this, when the flame arose, this is quoted from Josephus, when the flame arose, a scream as poignant as the tragedy went up from the Jews. A scream as poignant as the tragedy itself went up from the Jews. The object that they had guarded so closely was going to ruin. And while the temple was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000s of Jews that were caught on the Temple Mount were slain. There wasn't any preference played as to who was killed, young, old, profane, priests. All were killed in the same manner. They had their throats cut. They literally covered the ground so thick that the ground itself around the temple couldn't be seen. Reason for this, Temple Mount being this crowded with Jews, is it was a place of last defense as the city itself was being destroyed. Throngs of people had come in to the temple courts. This seems to have set up an orgy of destruction of everything on the Temple Mount being burned and destroyed, even though this had been against his orders. After it happened, Caesar gave orders to demolish the whole city. If you're going to sack a place, sack it good. They left 3 towers in the western wall and a place to garrison some troops, which I believe is what's on top of what's now called the Temple Mount. The rest of the city was destroyed. Picking up our story on the Mount of Olives again with Yeshua and the disciples. Evidently, Yeshua was sitting at the top of the Mount of Olives, and his Talmudim came to him privately. Mark records that it was Kepha, Yaakov, Yochanan, and Andrew. Peter, James, John, and Andrew were the ones that approached Yeshua. And being again emphasizing this 200 feet above the city, there was no doubt that the spectacle of the temple was laid out before them for them to see. All right. Mark 13:3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Kepha, Yaakov, Yochanan, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what sign will show when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Luke 21:7 says, "They asked him, 'Rabbi, if this is so, when will these events take place, and what sign will show that they're about to happen?'" Next, Matthew 24:3, on the same subject, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the Talmudim came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming, and that the Olam Hazah is ending?" That is the final age of man, ending. Well, these are actually 3 questions being asked by the disciples, by the Talmudim, in the form of one question. The question is really not just idle curiosity. It appears that these 4 that acted as spokesmen for the rest of the 12, appears that they felt that the fall of the temple was to signal the end of the age. That was their thinking in their minds. Interpreting something that Yeshua was saying as being the fall of the temple, signaling the end of the age. So their questions are all connected together in one. See, they were interpreting something into what Yeshua had been saying, and Yeshua separates these things, giving what actually amounts to 3 responses in the text that follows. But the way they asked the question, the context that they understood it in. How they connected the destruction of the temple with the end of the age in their mind, well, example is Yeshua had just told them, "This building, the temple, will be torn down, not one stone will be left standing." But he had also previously said in John chapter 3, verse 19, John 3:19, he had also said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." Thus, putting these 2 together and dealing with his restoration of the temple, his direct involvement in the restoration of the temple, that would be immediate, because they had taken these 2 things that he had told them and put them together in the one form. And that's not what he meant. It's not what Yeshua was meaning and what he was telling them there as they looked over the Temple Mount. Well, we can see how they could assemble this information. They're still trying to put everything together that he's been teaching them. The following verses in this discourse that we're studying make up Yeshua's response to their question, and he warns them that so terrible will be the judgments that will come upon Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem, who so persistently reject him, that the events accompanying these judgments against those people rejecting him at this time will be the foreshadowing of the final judgment on the people at his second coming, at his return. Do we follow that? It's for this reason that the prophecies connected with the events of the end times are closely linked with those of the destruction of Jerusalem then in the short term. That destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the short term then are giving us a picture that we can take forward. This also makes it difficult to distinguish between the portions of Yeshua's dissertation to them that referred to the Jews of Jerusalem at that time and the Jews of Jerusalem at the final judgment. We have to be able to pick these out, and since we're not in most cases reading from the original language, but only from translations as the translators have interpreted this, it can become difficult. This is particularly the case of Matthew and Mark. As we go on, we'll see that Luke separates them out a little bit more clearly. The phrase about leaving your house desolate, that is talking about leaving the generations of the Jews coming desolate. It's being pictured in the destruction of Jerusalem and the utter flattening of the temple at that point, and is to be taken in combination. We have to always take that in combination, that leaving your house desolate is speaking about the Jews, the generation of Jews that are coming, and has to always be taken in combination with, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I'm going to leave you desolate. You're going to be without me in any form of me. And you're not going to see me again until you call out for me to return, and then you will understand me, what this is. And we need answers. The disciples are saying, the disciples are telling Yeshua up there on that Temple Mount as they're looking out there, we need answers because we're not putting all this together. And they phrase this in the form of a threefold question. Tell us when these things will happen. What are the signs of your coming? And what are the signs of the end of the present age? One point needs to be driven home here. When Yeshua said, you will not see me again, is probably most accurate, that the you there means the Jewish people as a nation. You will not see me again. The Jewish people as a nation. So if we take this to his return, it's a promise to the Jewish people as a nation as to who will see him again first, and it will be them. In the study of Zechariah, chapters 12 through 14, we're given background, I think, that would help us understand this, but we have to put this all together. We learned in Zechariah chapter 12 that this will work because when he does return, they will see the one whom they pierced. And the entire nation of Israel will go into mourning when he comes back, as one mourns for a firstborn son. This will all become evident to them as he comes back, and they call out for him. This passage is to be taken more from the standpoint of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, in which the destruction of the temple and the appearance of the false Messiah are pictures. And they're also showing us what will be the last events of national history at that time, as a picture for us. The national history of Israel essentially ended in 70 Common Era. And Israel has had no national history until modern days, within my lifetime. Essentially, this destruction has the appearance, as a picture of, the last days in Israel's national history. Also will be a time when Israel's national history will come to an end, because Messiah will return and take over what we now call the state of Israel. We'll look more into that later. There's then the dismal blank silence of 1900 years that took place between the first national Israel being dissipated until Israel is reformed. Plus there's also the final years of the Gentiles, which will also be broken down by Yeshua's return. And again, we saw all of that in Zechariah. That's why Zechariah is really so important to us, and its study had to precede this. For us to really grasp this, we had to have Zechariah. Yeshua begins these answers to these disciples, the real answers, in Matthew 24:4. Yeshua replied, "Watch out, don't let anyone fool you." Mark 13:5, Yeshua began speaking to them, "Watch out, don't let anyone fool you." Luke 21:8, he answered, "Watch out, don't be fooled." And then he adds a little bit, which we're going to pick up again in a minute. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time has come." Don't go after them. But the first thing he says is, watch out, don't let anyone fool you. What Yeshua is basically doing here is saying, nothing's going to happen real quick. Warning here is not to expect his return in the end too soon. Introduces his answers to the Talmudim concerning the destruction of the temple. They're to take care or watch out. They're not to be deceived by courses of events that they will see and not to think the end has come. This is talking about the end of the age, and we'll see that this warning is repeated. What we have here is an exhortation, really, followed by supporting statements. Yeshua replied, "Watch out, don't let anybody fool you." An exhortation. And the reason given for that exhortation, watch out, don't let anybody fool you, is because what follows may fool them. He starts it out there in Luke 21:8. He said, "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time has come." Don't go after them. Take that to Matthew 24:5. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I'm the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray." And Mark 13:6, "Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will fool many people." What Yeshua is doing here is connecting any false impression that the Talmudim may have with what is actually going to happen. He's showing them that not everything that seems to be a sign of the end of the age in reality is going to be such a sign. And we went through tons of these in the first few years of the time after Yeshua ascended. In other words, he's saying here, there are signs that are general in makeup that can be interpreted as absolute, yet they're not. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. And Yeshua says there will be many false messiahs. Don't mistake them for the real one coming at the end of the age. There will be specific signs. The false messiah at the end of the age has to be accompanied by the physical presence of the land of Israel. That's a sign that has to be there before someone can actually claim to be the false messiah and being taken seriously. Well, we're there. We're there. The false messiah at the end of the age. Israel is now controlling a Jerusalem. We've got that now. And either a temple that he can desecrate it, or a temple mount ready for a temple to be built by him to desecrate, will be available to him. And that's there now. Historically, we have seen that none of the false messiahs that have appeared have had any of these, and this true false messiah that will come has to come. Has to be here before Yeshua returns. Don't follow him. Look for the signs. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. In history, we've seen thousands actually led astray. In the future, several more thousands are going to be led astray as we go through Revelation. We're going to see that. False messiahs are always accompanied by false prophets who give "Thus say Adonai" when Adonai hasn't spoken. If you want to look at that, it's in Ezekiel 22:28. Ezekiel 22:28. The language used here says, "in my name." Said that in Luke that we looked at. It says, "For many will come in my name." In Matthew and Mark, "Many will come in my name." My name is a technical expression meaning an appointed emissary or representative of Yeshua. This, taken in the language of "I am he," points to interpretation of the phrase "in my name." Literally, Yeshua is saying that is going to be someone taking to themselves the title and authority that properly belongs to me. These deceivers will claim God's deity for themselves. Man is particularly vulnerable during times of crisis, and these false messiahs rise up during times of crisis. The primary meaning of these verses is to be understood in terms of pretenders of the Messiah. Throughout the first century, there were many of these that did, in fact, win momentary support from various segments of the Jewish population. There was a succession of false messiahs that appeared and gathered followers. Their movements were scattered by their capture and death. Bar Kokhba probably is the most famous. He was responsible for the last revolt against Rome. He was a general that succeeded in raising an army of some means, had some early successes, and then the greatest sage of Judaism at that time, Rabbi Akiva, decided to name him Messiah. So, with that, a fairly substantial amount of Bar Kokhba's army were Messianic and following Yeshua's teachings, with him being proclaimed as their Messiah. So as a false Messiah is proclaimed, they ceased following Bar Kokhba and departed, rendered his army, and they were an essential part of his army. And that really was the final separation point between the Messianic Jews and the rest of Judaism. That's when the rest of Judaism fell on the Messianic movement and said, "You're traitors because of this action that you took then, by not following the Messiah that was named and leaving." They simply said, "No, we can't follow him because we can't follow a Messiah," and left. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed. More were sold into slavery. So many were reported sold into slavery that the slave markets were nearly ruined. The glut of slaves available for sale were so great you almost couldn't give them away. What was left of Israel in the land was decimated. There have been other false messiahs down through history, but are mostly minor players. Even at one point, Napoleon was under consideration as a possible messiah because of comments that he made about creating a homeland for Jews. In the mid-17th century was a significant false messiah. Around about 1665, a Turkish Jew named Shabbatai Zavi was claimed to be Messiah. He claimed it himself. It was thought that perhaps as many as half the Jews in the world believed him. German Jews packed barrels of food and clothing. They were preparing to move as soon as there was a liberated Israel. When Zavi made his demand of being given Palestine to the Sultan of Turkey, it was in the Turkish Empire, the Sultan of Turkey made him a counter-offer: convert to Islam or be tortured to death. Zavi took the name Muhammad Effendi and continued to live. The deal is, when the false Messiah that precedes Yeshua comes to power, the deception will be on again. And in Zechariah, we've learned that only a third of Israel will survive that period. Matthew 24:6. You'll hear the noise of wars nearby, the news of wars far off. See to it that you don't become frightened. Such things must happen, but the end is yet to come. Mark 13:7, when you hear the noise of wars nearby and the news of wars far off, don't become frightened. Such things must happen, but the end is yet to come. Luke 21:9, when you hear of wars and revolutions, don't panic, for these things must happen first, but the end will not follow immediately. Here Yeshua is warning against misinterpretation of coming events, such as wars and revolutions. His followers are not to be disheartened or diverted from their task. Don't sell everything and go up on the hill and wait for Yeshua to come. I'm going to tell you, we had a group here in Lee County that like 25 years ago, because one of the ladies in that group worked for me, they got word from their leader that Yeshua had given him the word that they were all to quit their jobs, sell their houses, and move to Arkansas and go to the top of a hill and wait there because Messiah was coming. And this lady quit her job, sold her house, and went to Arkansas. And I just got a nod here of somebody else that remembered that. Well, the Roman Empire that Yeshua is spoken of in those days had in place an extended period of peace that was going on at the time he was speaking of them. But within 40 years, political turmoil would impact that empire from one end to another, including the destruction of the temple in 40 years. In 1 year, Rome would have 4 emperors. In the years between 62 and 66, rumors of revolt were common. So wars and rumors of wars of themselves are not indicators that the end of the age is here. They, Yeshua's disciples, were asking a threefold question. When will this temple destruction be? 2, when are you coming? 3, what are the events leading up to your coming? They didn't realize they were asking 3 different things. They posed it as one question, and Yeshua is answering them, giving answers to all 3 questions. When you see the final wars and revolutions, including the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that's the answer to question 1. But don't take it as the answer to questions 2 and 3. Yeshua will answer those 2 questions, 2 and 3, as we continue at the same time in the same station next week. See you then.